Hello everyone, welcome to another section of World Lit 2111. We're going to do Dante's Inferno today. Dante is an incredibly influential and important author. T.S. Eliot said at one point, he says, Shakespeare and Dante divide the world between them. You know, this idea that there's Shakespeare and there's Dante and everybody else is number 3 or lower. We're still reading him over 700 years later. Why is that? I first read the Inferno when I was in high school, and I've read it more times than I can count since then. It's not that long. The Inferno itself you could read in a couple of days, and we do have the entire text in our book, and we are reading the entire text of the Inferno. But the Inferno is only one part of a 3-part single book called the Comedy. Later, we called it the Divine Comedy to distinguish it from every other comedy out there. Now, let's start with that. Comedy. When Dante, in 1300, wrote about a comedy, he didn't mean that word in the same sense that we think of that word. To us, comedy means something that's funny. And you're going to read this, and 98% of the time you're not going to think it's very funny. To the medieval and Renaissance reader, a comedy just meant it had a happy ending. It was any story with a happy ending was a comedy. And they live happily ever after. Comedy. Okay? As opposed to a tragedy, which is just a story that has a sad ending. That's it. That's all that those words mean. Now to Dante, the comedy is a... Well, what is the whole book about? You're going to read your introduction about it, and you read the introductory material. But the comedy itself is about a guy who's very much like Dante, but we should not confuse him with Dante. He's called the Pilgrim in the book. And the Pilgrim has a dream vision. He falls asleep, and he has a dream. And in this dream, he travels through hell, and then he climbs the mountain of purgatory, and then he goes to heaven, and he goes all the way through heaven and finally comes face to face with God. There's a lot in there that we can unpack one step at a time. Let's get back to our question of comedy. Dante himself was an exile from his home. The specifics you don't need to get into, other than to know that it was a political fight, essentially. This is in medieval Italy, and there was no kingdom or country of Italy proper. There were just individual cities in Italy, each of which ran themselves. And they were filled with political conflict and a lot of Machiavellian schemes to take over. And Dante ended up on the wrong side of one of these feuds. And he got put under a penalty of death if he stayed in the city. So he had to leave. And he spent the rest of his life in exile from his homeland. Now, he was already famous by the time that he wrote the comedy. He was famous for writing love poetry. He didn't feel much like writing love poetry after he was kicked out of his home city and under sentence of death. And he began to wonder about this question that we've come back to on and on again and again in this class, and that is, why do bad things happen to good people? And he writes this book in which he reveals, in a sense, God's plan. He tries to rationalize the way things work and his Catholic faith, and Dante was a very devout Catholic, Christian man, but he was not blind to the corruption that was going on in the church at the time. And the papacy was filled with scandal, and the church itself wasn't being the good role model that it should be, and so on. So he could see that there was a lot of bad stuff in the world, but how do we get through that? How do we rationalize? How do we live in a world where bad stuff like this happens? And he calls his book The Comedy, because as is made clear to the pilgrim in his journey, everything's going to be okay. The happy ending that Dante is talking about when he calls this book the comedy is the happy ending that we all of us who are good, will eventually go to. We will all, like the pilgrim, eventually go to heaven and be face to face with God. And in that perfect moment of eternal bliss, all of this bad shit that happened to us for the rest of our lives is going to be forgotten and go away. And that's why he calls it the comedy. It's not because it's filled with laughter. There's not a lot of jokes in this book. There's a few, but not many. It's because Dante was confident that the world has a happy ending, that our lives have a happy ending, if we're good, if we deserve the happy ending. Right? Okay. So after he was kicked out of his homeland, he went thinking about, well, I want to write an epic poem. I want to write something that's going to change literature. I want to write something that's incredibly important and influential, and what should I write on? And he picked the comedy. He picked God. He played around with a couple of other topics. He thought about writing a King Arthur epic. Arthurian legend has a very strong tradition in Italy. There's a lot of Italian Arthurian stories. Excuse me. But he decided against it, thank God. And he wrote the comedy instead. Now, the comedy is different. It's unique in a lot of ways. One of those ways is the language that it's written in. It's written in what we call the vernacular. Vernacular. Now, what does that mean? The vernacular just means that it was written in the language that the people around him could read. In other words, it wasn't written in Latin or Greek or anything, highbrow like that. It was written in ordinary Italian, which, to us here in Brunswick is hard, but to the 14th century Italians, it was easy. So he wrote a poem that anybody could read. And this question, should poetry be difficult, complex, require learning simply to approach? Or should it be simple and easy and something for everyone? This is a debate we're still having today. And Dante was firmly on the side of the second group, right? We should make poetry that anybody can read. And we have a really good translation in our book because the language in the Inferno, in our translation, is very simple. It's very straightforward. Now, that doesn't mean that the poem is easy to understand, but the words are easy to understand, if that makes any sense. Okay, and that's very much in the spirit of Dante himself. Okay. One other thing that we mentioned a few minutes ago, and that's this idea that the comedy is a dream vision, that the character of the pilgrim has fallen asleep. And in his dream, he's walking through a wood. This is the very beginning of the poem. Now he's walking through a dark wood. And he sees these three animals, a wolf, a lion, and a leopard. And they each threaten him. And he's strong-willed enough he's trying to climb the hill. And he doesn't fight them, but he's not intimidated by them until the wolf shows up, the she-wolf. And there's something about her that is especially terrifying to him. And he begins to retreat back down the hill. And that's when Virgil shows up. Yeah, that guy, Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, is a character, a major character in this book. And he shows up and he escorts the pilgrim, not up the hill, but down through hell. And he escorts him through hell for the next 33 chapters. Now, the comedy is intended to be one book that's 100 chapters long. Each chapter is called a canto, which just means a song. And 33 of them are in hell, and 33 of them are in purgatory, and 33 of them are in heaven, or paradise. And then there's one this one that we first just talked about, where he's standing on the hill and walking through the dark forest, that is the one that's separate from all the others, right? And we just sort of lump it in with the Inferno because we've got to put it somewhere. So we're going to read 34 of these cantos. We're going to read all the Inferno stuff. Now, Purgatory and Paradise are also great poetry, but they tend to not be as interesting to a lot of us because, well, let's be frank, heaven's kind of boring. There's no conflict. There's no struggle. There's no the closer we get to God, the less troublesome the journey becomes. It becomes easier and faster the closer you get. And in many ways, the hardest part of the journey is the part in hell. And so that's the part that has captivated scholars the most. And if we had more time, we would read Paradise and we would read Purgatory. There are excerpts in your book. But our book has the complete Inferno, so that's what we're going to read. These cantos are not very long. They're like a couple of pages, like 2¼ pages each. So you can skim through them very quickly. And there's something, it's different than a lot of our texts that we had to read because you feel like you're making progress. The Inferno, hell, we have a map in your book. If you look, I'm on page 391. You have a map of hell. And one of the reasons why we can do maps like this is because Dante is very specific about his landscape and his geography. In his idea of the world in this book. All right, so you've got Jerusalem, right? The most holy city on earth. And hell is underneath Jerusalem. It's this cone-shaped. It's like a funnel. And it has 9 circles of hell. And a lot of these things that we're going to talk about in the Inferno, are going to sound familiar to you, going to sound cliched. This idea that, for example, that there's 9 levels of hell. Well, Dante thought of it first, right? This is all created here. And other people have been so captivated by Dante's conception of the geography of hell that they've stolen it and they've used it, and shamelessly. And you'll see it in films and television shows and songs and movies and all kinds of things, books, all kinds of things. So those of you that saw like that film What Dreams May Come, for example, references hell. There are video games based on Dante's Inferno. There's a science fiction book by Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven where it's set in the modern day, and instead of being escorted through hell by Virgil, he's escorted through hell by Benito Mussolini, right, the dictator of Italy during World War II. The Inferno was incredibly influential. But anyway, let's get back to the geography. Dante has a very specific landscape that he has in mind when he plans all this out, and it's very specific and detailed, and this has led artists to go back and try and reconstruct it. So let me give you a tip, all right? Open up your Google Foo, put in Dore, D-O-R-E, and Inferno, Dore, Inferno. Hit search, and then click by image, sort by image. And what you will see is these full illustrations of the Inferno, literally every canto, illustrated by one of the greatest artists in our history. His name is Gustave Doré. He was an engraver. And he was commissioned to create illustrations of the Inferno, and they are fantastic, and they're horrifying, and amazingly detailed, and just pop them up, and then as you read, keep those Doré illustrations of the Inferno kind of handy, because as we read, you'll find everything is there. The hill where Virgil finds him, where he's threatened, the dark wood, the raging tempest where the lustful are swirled around in a giant tornado, and Paolo and Francesca, and the wood of the suicides, and the Minotaur and King Minos, and Gurion and the city of Dis, and finally all the way down at the bottom when we get to Satan trapped in the ice. Every fantastic landmark of hell has been illustrated by hundreds of artists over the 7 centuries since this book was written. And that's because the book is so compelling. Okay, so you've got this map on 391, and you can see that hell has got 9 circles, and it goes down like a cone. And we travel down the edge of the cone, the funnel, until we get to the bottom, and that's where Satan is. And then finally, at the very end, he crawls down underneath Satan, and it turns out there's a hole. Satan is the farthest possible from God, right? Think about it. Where else would Satan be? Satan would be as far as possible from God, not because he chose to be there, but because that's where God put him. Okay? So that means that if God is somewhere above, then Satan is at the center of the earth. And if you dug down all the way past Satan, and then you have that little tunnel, there's a tunnel that then leads out past him. Well, now, if Satan's at the bottom, at the middle of the earth, then as soon as you go past him, you're no longer going down, you're going up towards the other side of the world, right? Yes, Dante knew the world was round. This is 1300, okay? So now if here's the world, right? Jerusalem is here. Hell is down, and then in the center of the earth is Satan, and then at the exact opposite is the mountain of purgatory. All right? And then if you climb the mountain of purgatory, eventually you would get to heaven, eventually, which is as far as possible from Satan. Okay. So if you look at our map here, and I'm on 391, you'll see it lists on the far right side which cantos deal with each of the various circles of hell. And we go through a bunch of them very quickly. It's like one canto, one circle, until we get to about the 7th or 8th circle, and then suddenly we slow down and we spend a lot of time on the individual parts of that circle until we finally get to the 9th circle where Satan is. And all this way, the pilgrim is guided by Virgil, by the ghost of Virgil. Okay, why is Virgil in hell? Was Virgil a bad guy? No. But we have to understand that Dante's conception is very much informed by his Catholic faith. And the rules of Catholic faith were ironclad. There is no redemption without Christ. There is no heaven without Christ. And so if you were born before Christ, I don't care how good you are, you can't go to heaven. And we see this at the very beginning of the book. Okay, well, let's rewind a little bit and let's talk ourselves through it. Oh, we mentioned one thing. We didn't get into this. This is the idea of the dream vision. One last thing I want to do before we get into the pit. And we're gonna have to go circular a couple of times in this poem, but that's not uncharacteristic for Dante, so maybe it's not so bad. Why is this poem a dream vision? Why does he say, I had a dream, and in this dream I went to hell? Why doesn't he just go to hell and do it all himself? Why does he do the dream? Well, okay. In the medieval mind, the whole idea of writing fiction, that is, writing a made-up story, was not looked upon in the same way that we look upon it now. Today, we just accept fiction and non-fiction. It's true. Is it based on true facts, or is it a story that we've made up? It doesn't really much matter. And we freely acknowledge that we're going to play liberal with the facts sometimes. We have based on a true story, inspired by a true story, which means it's not really much like a true story at all, but we kind of got a cool idea from it. In the Middle Ages, to write fiction was to lie. To write something that didn't happen was deceitful and therefore wrong. So instead, people would write stories and say, this really happened, but it didn't. But by giving themselves cover and posing it as fact, they covered their asses in this charge against being deceitful and lying. It was not cool to write a fantasy story. If you wanted to write a story about elves and wizards and dwarves and dragons and all that stuff, like Beowulf, In medieval Europe, you couldn't do that. But you could say, I had a dream, and in my dream I saw all these things. Oh, well then that's okay, because it was just a dream. And Dante does this, and Chaucer will do this again later, and many, many fantasy writers in the medieval period did this because this is how they could write fantasy. Dante puts himself in the dream as a character called the Pilgrim, which is modeled on Dante himself, but is not exactly him. As you're reading this book in our text, you're going to really be distracted by all the footnotes. Dante's book is a book about his time. As he's wandering through hell, he sees all these people he knows. Because, let's be honest, that would happen to all of us, right? Right? He's going through hell, and he sees all these people he knows from his home city or from elsewhere in Italy or whatever. Now, the poem is set when the Pilgrim is 35 years old. But Dante was older than that when he was writing. In other words, he's writing about his own past. So when the Pilgrim meets people, and those characters that are in hell prophesy about the future, they can talk about events that to them haven't happened yet, but to Dante, the author, are in his past. So this is how it would be like us. It would be like say you wrote a story about going down to hell, and you visit hell and you meet John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy tells you prophecies about how, oh, you will elect the first black president or whatever, right? Okay, to him it's the future, but to us, reading it, it's the past. The footnotes are going to be really distracting because they explain who all these people are, and they explain all these sorts of terms and things. Okay. And when I was rereading in preparation for our class, I found the footnotes very distracting. You'll have to find a way to read without getting distracted by the footnotes. Maybe read the whole canto first and then go back and check the footnotes, or wait until you can find a good stopping point and then kind of catch up on footnotes or whatever. But try not to let the footnotes distract you from the poem, because it's a pretty cool story. I mean, think about it. It's about this guy who goes through hell, and literally, and he sees all these people, and they're all being tortured, and he wants to find out who they are, and there's monsters and danger and excitement, and it's a cool story. So don't let the footnotes trip you up, okay? They don't let them be speed bumps to stop you from getting into the story. If you're having a good time reading the story, you don't have to stop to read a footnote, okay? All right. He starts off on the hill, and he sees those three animals. Everything in the Inferno, everything in the comedy is an allegory. This is an allegorical text. What does that mean? That means that literally everything he's walking through is a symbol. It doesn't just mean, when he sees a wolf, a lion, and a leopard, it's not just a lion, a wolf, and a leopard. It's a metaphor. It's an allegory for something else. In this case, 3 different kinds of sin. The wolf is the sins of desire, of greed and lust. Whenever you want more than you have, whether you want money or food or sex or whatever. The second animal, the lion, are sins of violence, of wrath. Okay, murderers. Violence against other people, violence against yourself, violence against God. The third is the leopard. The leopard represents the sins of deception, of deceit. Now, which of these 3 kinds of sins is the worst kind of sin? Well, if we were to judge, we might say probably murder, right? Because It's all of our crime shows and all of our movies, and everything is about violent crime. But not to Dante and not to his Catholic teaching, because, well, rewind yourself. Try to figure out from the evidence what is the worst kind of sin. And Dante asks, well, who's the worst sinner? Well, the most perfect sinner is Lucifer himself. And what is Lucifer's crime? It's not murder. It's lying. It's treason. He betrayed. And that becomes the greatest sin. Betrayal. Treason is the greatest sin. And the leopard, which represents all of these deception, deceitful, treason sins, is the worst of the sins. But not the most dangerous of the sins for our pilgrim. Remember how we were talking about how the pilgrim is going up the hill and he's threatened by these three animals and he can get past two of them, but the wolf, the she-wolf, is the one that cows him and makes him retreat back down the hill. Well, that's because Dante understood that for most of us, it's those sins, the sins of wanting more food, wanting more money, wanting more love, that are the most tempting and the most powerful on us. The hardest to resist. Let's put it that way. Maybe not the most serious for our soul. After all, if you eat too much, if you want to get greedy, you want to get rich, who does it hurt, right? We had this idea that, it's a victimless crime. All of which just goes into making the sin harder to resist. Now, we'll get to the victim later. Dante will get to that point. But right now, he's just saying, look, those are the sins that are the hardest to resist. They're the most seductive. And so that's the one that the pilgrim has the most trouble with. And you're going to see this throughout the first few cantos of the book. Keep your eye out while you're reading, and you'll see a few points in the book where the poet passes out. Like he'll see somebody. He sees Francesca. Paolo and Francesca in one of the early cantos is one of the most famous scenes from the entire comedy. Paolo and Francesca are guilty of lust. And what you'll find in the Inferno is that everyone in the Inferno is punished according to their sins. So a particular punishment has been devised that is a sort of poetic justice version of their sin. So they're forced to endure their sin forever and be tortured in the process. Paolo and Francesca had an affair. Francesca was married. Paolo was her teacher. And when you get to the chapter, you'll read that they were reading together. What were they reading? They were reading Lancelot, the story of Sir Lancelot, probably the Knight of the Cart, which we may get to later in the semester. I forget our syllabus. Anyway. They're reading the story of Sir Lancelot, and as they are reading, they give in to their desire for each other. And literally at that moment, Francesca's husband comes in and kills them both. Well, because they gave in to their lust, Paolo and Francesca are doomed to spend eternity in hell in a storm. There's this furious whirlwind. And because they were victims of their emotion, they were caught up by their passionate, tempestuous emotions when they were alive. So they are caught up in a passionate tempest forever now that they are dead. And Francesca is lured over by Dante, by the pilgrim, and she tells him this story, which was actually based on actual events during Dante's life, and everybody that had read this book knew about this famous story. And then as the pilgrim is listening to her story, when she finishes, he's so swept up with empathy for Francesca that he passes out. He falls unconscious. Okay, this is really important stuff. We should be asking ourselves, why does he do that? What's going on here? Because the author didn't make that happen by accident. What's going on here? Well, look at the sin. And look at what it was that seduced Paolo and Francesca into being so transgressive. The answer? It was literature. I mean, they were reading love stories. The kinds of love stories that Dante wrote before he was exiled from his city. In other words, Dante he recognizes how compelling literature and desire can all be. And the Pilgrim makes a mistake of feeling pity and sympathy for these sinners. Okay, they're sinners. They're in hell. And notice they're not just in purgatory, where you can work your way out. Those of you that purgatory is not part of Protestant Christianity, it's only part of Catholic Christianity, so a lot of Protestants don't know or don't understand. But the idea is pretty straightforward, that you're guilty of sin, but you're not, you're guilty of sin, but you acknowledge that you did something wrong. You acknowledge that you have been in error, and you want to pay a penance. You want to burn off the sin. So you go to purgatory and you suffer for a while, but the more serious your sins were, the more you have to suffer. But eventually, you work it off, and you're allowed to go to heaven. Why are people in hell instead of in purgatory? Why is Francesca and Paolo in hell instead of purgatory? Well, the answer is because they don't repent. They don't think they've done anything wrong. They insist that they are wrongly persecuted, that God is unfair. And you can't go to purgatory when you think that you're being unfairly persecuted. You have to accept that you are the one who was wrong. Francesca and Paolo cannot make that admission. They cannot admit that they were wrong. And the Pilgrim, when he feels pity for them, he is also acknowledging that he thinks maybe they aren't wrong. Maybe, can't we feel for them? And Virgil, who's his guide through the Inferno, keeps telling him, man, you have got to get over this. You have got to get over your habit of trying to sympathize and feel pity for damned souls in hell. These people are being punished forever by God. You have to accept that God is right, and this punishment they deserve. And sometimes that's really hard for the Pilgrim, like when he's encountering the lustful, because, maybe Dante lusted. And when some of these people, they're in hell because they were reading a book that maybe Dante can identify with. Other times in the Inferno, this is going to be really easy for the Pilgrim, like when he encounters traitors and all kinds of violent people. These are not sins that Dante himself ever felt compelled to participate in, and so it's easy for him to acknowledge the justice of their eternal punishment. So we'll see the Pilgrim like kicking some guys in the head when they're frozen in ice from the neck down, and Dante just kind of kicks him in the head, and he grabs their hair and pulls their hair out and stuff like that. Dante has no pity and no sympathy for those. And it's in those moments when Virgil says, hey, good on you, you're learning. These guys are being punished. They're being punished for a reason. And by participating in their punishment, by punishing them, you're helping God. You are doing God's work. It's different in purgatory. These people did bad things, but they acknowledge they did bad things, and they want to get better. The people in hell, they don't want to get better. They lament their sorry state. They're like, oh, this is miserable. We're miserable forever. Yes. And whose fault is that? And they say, God's. No, it's not God's. It's your fault. Right? Okay. Or they blame somebody else. They'll blame somebody else for their problem. Like Francesca. Who does she blame? She doesn't blame Paolo or herself. She blames the book. She says, oh, it's Lancelot's fault. It's the book's fault. The book made us kiss. Okay, the book didn't make you kiss. You kissed. But by blaming the book, she displaces her guilt. And that's what gets her in hell. And that's what gets the pilgrim to identify with her. Because, it's the book's fault. Okay. All right. Let's take a brief break. We'll come back in a minute, okay? All right, let's resume. We're going to go back down through the cantos fairly quickly, okay? And we've talked a lot about the big issues that are going on in this book, and you'll see more of them as we go, but let's start getting to some fine details. My hope is that you can find this useful as you sort of walk through the cantos for yourself. Let's look at our map, right? We're on 391 again. And there's a lot of different versions of this map. The sins in hell are broadly categorized by the kinds of sin. So all of those sins of the she-wolf, all of those lust and greed and all that stuff, that's all early in hell, the top third or so. And then the sins of wrath are in the middle. And then the sins of treason or deception or betrayal are at the bottom. Okay? And Dante goes pretty fast through most of these. And then when he gets to the betrayal ones, he slows down and we start taking our long time. Okay? Now, the first people he encounters on your little map here is called the neutrals in the quote-unquote anti-Inferno. Okay, these are not words that Dante uses. These are words that critics have labeled. But the first group are people who have never done anything wrong. They've never done anything evil. But they've also never done anything good. They are the people that have simply never taken a stand either way. Not because they chose to, but because they just didn't care enough. They're nobodies. They're the sheep. There's sheep and shepherds, right? And Dante is taking a stab here at all the people who never cared enough about their own life and their own soul to make up their mind, to take a stand. Those people, they don't really go to hell, but there's also no spot in heaven for them. You have to choose God. If you don't choose God, you don't get to go to heaven. Well, but you didn't choose Satan either. Well, then you go here. You go to this neutral space where everybody sort of wanders around confused. And then we have the first layer of hell that we get to pretty quickly. And it's called limbo. And pop up your Dory illustrations because there's a first shot of right there of limbo. And the pilgrim meets whom Dante calls the virtuous pagans. Now remember what we were talking about in the way that this is, the Inferno is based on Catholic faith and the doctrines of the church, and it's very specific. You cannot go to heaven without Christ. If you didn't know Christ, you can't go to heaven. So that means that everybody born before Christ, we're talking about the entire population of the world before Christ, cannot go to heaven. They all go here. So all the famous people from Rome and Greece and all the Jews that we read about in the Hebrew Bible and all those guys, they all went here. And then, they waited there for a very, very long time, 1,000 years maybe. And then, remember Christ's story. He's killed on the cross, right? And then he's dead for 3 days. And then on the third day, he wakes up, he rises again. Well, Dante has there's this tradition in Catholic faith of where was Christ during those 3 days? Where was he? Was he up in heaven talking to Dad? Or was he? And the tradition is that no, actually, he was in hell. Christ went to hell, not as a victim, but to clean it out. He went as like the ultimate pest control service. And it's called the harrowing of hell. The harrowing of hell. And so Christ comes down to hell, and he finds particular Jews that were important to the Christian faith, like Jacob and Isaac and Joseph and people like that. And he saves them. And he says, okay, you guys come with me. We're going to go to heaven. You come with me. Everybody else, sorry. You stay here. Forever. Okay? Or at least until the end of time. And then he goes down through hell, and you'll see signs of Christ's journey through hell in a few particular places in the book. For example, pretty soon, Dante, the Pilgrim, and Virgil find the gate of hell. This is the abandon all hope, ye who enter here, sort of famous quote, right? We find this massive gate, the entrance to hell, literally the entrance to hell. And it's busted. The gate is like all off its hinges. It won't close. Well, why is that? Because Christ threw it open. Because he came down here and he, gestured and boom, gates blew open. And he went in and he actually caused an earthquake in hell when he went through. Now, to Dante's time, he's writing in the 14th century. This would have been like 1,300 years ago, right? And the people that are in hell, some of them remember that because they were alive. They were in hell already back in 33 A.D. But others are new, and they've only been in hell since after that time, so they don't remember that day when that guy came, that mysterious guy came, and nobody could do anything to him, and he would gesture, and people would come free, and so on. Okay. Well, okay, so the virtuous pagans. This is all of the good people that ever lived, except for those very small handful of specific named individuals that Christ took up to heaven. So this is where Virgil himself has been all this time. Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, and Homer, and all the other great writers. And this is what happens. As soon as Dante, the Pilgrim, shows up with Virgil, Virgil introduces him to all the other great poets. And Ovid is there, and Horace is there, and all these guys, they welcome the Pilgrim amongst them. It's like, oh, about time you came by. We've been keeping our eye on you, and they welcome him like he's just one of the gang. And they say, oh, now the 6 of us, we're like the 6 best poets ever. And it's all very flattering to Dante, and he obviously had a high opinion of his own poetic skill. This is to be compared with Chaucer. When Chaucer writes a similar story, he writes a story called The House of Fame, where he has a dream vision, because he can't just write about these sort of fantasy stories. He has a dream vision, and he goes to this place called the House of Fame, where all the famous people live. And he sees these incredibly tall towers, like these pillars, and all the famous people are up on top of these tall pillars, and he can barely see them and barely recognize, look, that's Dante, way, way up there. And this is how Chaucer felt, right? Like, those are the giants of literature. Those are the giants of poetry. And I'm like this little tiny guy way down here that, can't even see them. That's Chaucer's version. Dante is like, oh, we're all buds. All right? All right, so they don't linger very long where the virtuous pagans are, before they have to cross their first river. And Virgil leads him across the river. And he has another passing out, another fainting spell. And then we get quickly into the various sins. The lustful are first. We've already talked about Paolo and Francesca. It's a really great scene. Keep your eye on it. And then the gluttons, the prodigal, and the miserly. Notice that a lot of these sins are paired in this section. The prodigal are people that spend too much. Remember the prodigal son? Story of the guy who went out and blew his inheritance. Right, before he comes back and says, I repent and I want to be good again. And the miserly, the guys that don't spend enough. Likewise, people that starve themselves, that don't eat enough, are just as guilty as people that eat too much. There's a moderation, there's a golden mean kind of idea being put forward in Dante. People that, later on you'll see this again with the wrathful, people who are so violent all the time, and the slothful, the people that are violent not at all ever, right? They don't have even enough energy to get up off their sofa, right? They just want to play video games all day. These two sides of the same coin, and both equally guilty. Both equally guilty. Remember that everything that you're seeing here is a metaphor. It's all an allegory, and this is why Dante's poem is so rich for us, why we can read it 700 years later and still be talking about it, because the language is simple. But trying to figure out what all the symbols mean, not only is it hard, but it varies by generation by generation. All right, in the Gluttons, you'll find Chiacho, a famous another famous scene. A lot of these people that we're meeting in the journey down through hell are people that Dante knew, and maybe he hadn't seen them for a long time because he was in exile, but he puts them in hell, and maybe they never repent of their actions, because that would mean they wouldn't be in hell; they'd be in purgatory. But they often blame other people. They say, "Oh, it's not my fault. It's that other guy, and he made me do it, or it's his, You'll walk through each of the different circles. So you've got Limbo. You've got and King Minos. It turns out, so you find a lot of things out here about how punishment works. How does God's system work? And one of those individuals who makes that system work is Minos. You'll find Minos. He's in Circle 2, right at the edge of Limbo, going into the lustful. There's this monstrous judge, and all the souls that come to hell come up in front of him, and he measures how guilty they are, and he's got like a serpent tail, and his serpent tail wraps around them, and the more times it wraps around them, the farther down in hell they have to go. We've encountered Minos before. Minos was the king of the Minoans, which was one of the possible places for the city of Troy, if you remember our reading on the Iliad. Minos was betrayed by his wife, who fell in love, but didn't just have an affair. This is a Greek legend, okay? This is not based on fact. She fell in love with a magic bull, like it was a divine bull or something. And so she went off and but she couldn't get the bull to have sex with her, because that's what she really wanted. She wanted the bull to have sex with her, but she couldn't, because, it was an animal. So she gets this really smart inventor guy named Daedalus to make her a bull suit, make her a cow suit. So she climbs into the fake cow, and the fake cow is so beautiful that the bull falls in love with it. And pretty soon, Pasiphae, that's the name of Minos' wife, pretty soon she's pregnant with the bull's baby. And so she gives birth to the Minotaur, which is a monster with a bull head, but a human body. And the Minotaur was this horrible monster. So Minos, when his wife gives birth to a monster, throws the Minotaur in the bottom of his palace, which is this very elaborate maze. And then Minos was a very powerful king, and all the cities of Greece owed tribute to him. So they would pay tribute to him in the form of 7 men and 7 women, young boys and young girls, who would come to the island of Crete, and Minos would put them down in his dungeon with the Minotaur, where they would battle to the death. Does this sound familiar? This is where the Hunger Games comes from. This is where the myth of the Hunger Games is born. So may the odds ever be in your favor. After the gluttonous are the sins of wealth in Circle 4. We've gone already like one canto apiece, all the way down to Circle 4. Circle 5 is separated from the rest by the river Styx, which you'll have to cross again. There's a few rivers in hell. There's actually 4. One of them is frozen over, so it hardly counts. And in this one, there's Charon, which is the boatman, and all the souls get in the boat, but Dante gets in. When the pilgrim gets in it, the boat actually sinks down, right? Because pilgrim's still got a body. The others are just souls. And he's taken across to the city of Dis, which is if you look on your map, you'll find this right around circle 5, between 5 and 6. And this is the city of iron that is in hell. It's inhabited by all the fallen angels, all the angels that left the service of God to follow Lucifer. And you'll encounter more and more monsters as you go. People like the Medusa and the Furies and the Centaur. And the Minotaur shows up later on, and so on. All of these monsters, characters from Greek and Roman myth. At every one of these stages, the sinners are being punished. They're being tortured. Now, they're only souls. They don't have their bodies. They're only souls. But in Dante's cosmology, in his idea, punishments that are inflicted on the soul are still felt as if it was your body. But it's not your body. Your body's up in the earth, buried, rotting, right? Until when? Until Judgment Day. Until Christ comes again, and all the bodies rise up, and every soul is reunited with their body for the final judgment, right? And everybody that gets to go to heaven goes to heaven, and everybody that's still going to be in hell is reunited with their bodies back in hell, where their tortures resume, only now they're actually in their bodies, so it all hurts even more. When Judgment Day comes, the universe becomes perfect. Everybody in heaven, your bliss is perfect. Everybody in hell, your torture is also perfect. And in order for that to happen, your body and your soul are reunited, and the pain that you undergo is now all the more vivid and real, because it's happening not just to your body, but to your soul as well. As Dante is going through, the pilgrim is going down through hell, he will often encounter souls, and he'll ask them who they are, and they'll identify themselves, and they'll often prophesy about the future. This leads many students to ask, well, how do they know? How do they know what's going on in the future? This is part of their punishment. Virgil outlines it all. He makes it all clear to the pilgrim, but we'll walk through it a bit here. Part of their punishment is they don't know the present. They don't know what's happening in the world today. They only know what's happening in the future. Okay, now imagine that life, the entire history of the universe, is a line. It's an arrow that starts with the creation, right? Let there be light, boom. And then the universe progresses until that final moment when Judgment Day comes. And Christ comes and the world is destroyed and all of time ends because it's just perfect forever. It's unchanging perfection from that moment forward. Time itself no longer occurs. You're just one perfect moment forever. Okay. The people in hell only see the future. But if the future has an end point, then what they can see is slowly shrinking, one day at a time, 1 minute at a time. The amount of the world that they are allowed to know is shrinking until that moment when the future catches up with Judgment Day, the present, and there is now no future. There is no future because there is no time. And at that moment, and for the rest of their eternity in hell, the sinful will not know anything because there is no future. There is only the present forever. And when all you know is the future, then you can know nothing. And they are aware of this. And the people in hell know this. And they know that their awareness is slowly shrinking to nothing. And that is part of their punishment in hell, to see that shrinking happening. Okay. Circle 7 is the Minotaur. The violent are here, including tyrants, people who maintain control over others based on violence. If you look at the violent, for example, you can help understand how Dante classifies sins and how are some sins more serious than others? The first kind of sin are sins against yourself. And this is where things like gluttony and lust and stuff like that really happen. Because who are you hurting? Well, you're hurting you. You're not hurting nobody. You're hurting you. And in the wrathful, we see this in the wood of the suicides. So all the people that were overly violent to themselves are punished. How are they punished? They are turned into trees. They're turned into trees, which are then, like Dante's walking, the pilgrim's walking through, and Virgil says, "Oh, look at that tree over there. Go break a branch off of that tree. I bet you'll find what happens pretty interesting." And Dante goes over, the pilgrim goes over, he snaps off a little twig, and blood starts to come out. And it's a person. And the blood is also words. There's like words coming out. Let's see if we can find this. It's Canto 13. I'm on page 434. Like a green log burning at one end only, sputtering at the other, oozing sap, and hissing with the air it forces out, so from that splintered trunk a mixture poured of words and blood. I let the branch I held fall from my hand and stood there stiff with fear. The blood is coming out from the broken off stick, and as the blood's coming out, it's also words. It's like writing somehow. It's like smoke letters or something. It's physically letters coming out. And it spells out what the person is saying. Why are you tearing me? Right? Why do you rip me? Have you no sense of pity whatsoever? Men were we once. Now we are changed to scrub. But even if we had been souls of serpents, your hand should have shown more pity than it did. Why did Virgil tell Dante to do this? Go over there and hurt that suicide who's been made into a tree. Because that's part of the punishment. You're supposed to do this because these people are wrong. And they were wrong, and they refuse to acknowledge that they're wrong, and now they are to be punished. And it sounds like to us like kind of a dick move, but that's because Dante is doing his job. The Inferno is one of the most seductive poems ever written. And every time that you sympathize and identify with these people and you feel sorry for them, that's Satan winning. I mean, in this book, because you're not supposed to feel sorry for them. Because God doesn't feel sorry for them. And it's hard for us. And Dante acknowledges that difficulty when the pilgrim himself, in the book, struggles to overcome it. And Virgil berates him and says, "You're such an idiot." When words become blood, and we're reading a poem of words, then the words become like a kind of body. But it's a poem about a place, about the world. And that also becomes, so if it's a world that's like a poem, and the poem is like a body, then the world is like a body. And this is one of Dante's deep metaphors, that the universe, the whole world, is like a book. Well, if the whole world is a book, then who wrote it? Who's the author? Right? And our job is to learn how to read it. And the comedy is allegorical in the sense that everything we see in it is a symbol. Because, in a sense, everything we see is a symbol. Everything around us has a meaning in it, put there by an author. And our job is to figure out how to read that metaphor and to get the meaning out of the book, right? And what kind of book is it? Is it a book with a happy ending or a book with a sad ending? Well, it's called the comedy, right? But understanding that the book has a happy ending, that the world that we're in has a happy ending, is really hard because it's a hard book. It looks easy, but the meaning is hard. And that's what Dante's done here. He's created a poem that's a metaphor for the world. Okay. Farther down in the violent, you're going to see other sins. You may not immediately recognize what they are. Usurers. What's a usurer? A usurer is somebody who makes loans for profit. Christ specifically forbids the charging of interest on a loan. You can't make money off of a loan if you're a Christian. This was not forbidden in the Hebrew Bible. If you remember when we talked about this, like Christ took all of the rules that Moses put down and he doubled down on them. You know, Moses said, well, you have to don't kill people. And Christ said, well, not only can you not kill people, you have to love your enemy. It's like he took everything that the old rules and just made them all twice as hard. Well, the Hebrew Bible didn't prohibit against charging interest on loans, but Christ does. Remember, Christ has pretty nasty words in his book for bankers. That's when he loses his temper is at the moneylenders, right? So for all of the medieval period, we're talking about 1,000 years of human history. If you wanted a loan and you were living in Christian Europe, you couldn't go to 95% of the people that you knew. You had to go to the local loan guy who was Jewish, because his religion allowed him to give out loans. And this was the source of a lot of anti-Semitism, because what you end up happening is a lot of people who all owed money, and of course they didn't want to pay it back. And it started small, but just got getting higher until eventually the whole king, like the king of France, owes 1 million gold pieces to Jewish bankers that he doesn't want to pay. And so instead he just kicks all the Jews out of his country and writes off the debt and says, I guess I'm just not going to pay it because I'm going to kick you out of the country instead. People in towns and villages, something would go wrong in town and people would start to get worried and hateful, and they pick somebody to hate, and they all owe money to the same guy, so it's really easy to blame that guy, and this creates a lot of anti-Jewish hysteria and discrimination that often ended very violently, with the Jewish inhabitants of these towns being run out of town, not because they were unfair bankers, but because people didn't want to pay them back, and they needed somebody to blame. Which kind of reminds us of something else in this book, right? All these people that don't accept responsibility for their own problems. Well, in hell, there's a whole spot just for usurers, just for bankers who make money off of loans. They have a whole little spot just in hell for themselves. Another long canto is devoted to the Sodomites. Now, this is the 14th century, okay? So, civil rights and equality and the idea that you can love whoever you want to love, that Dante himself acknowledges the difficulties here, because as you get to this section, the Sodomites are in circle 7. One of his own teachers is here. His name is Brunetto Latini, and the Pilgrim makes a point of noting that there's many other wonderful poets and intelligent, smart people here, people that the Pilgrim admires. But they're here because they were gay, because they were homosexual. They engaged in homosexual acts. Their punishment is to walk in one direction, but their head is permanently turned in another, because they are against nature. They are, remember, this is the sins of the violent. You know, like the violent. Why are homosexuals in the violent? Well, because they are committing a violence against God, against nature. According to Dante and this 14th century Catholic thinking, your natural, the nature of your body is to be heterosexual, and by choosing something else, you are turning away from that. This whole idea that homosexuality might not be a choice, that it might be something you were just born in your genes to be homosexual, that idea was completely foreign to the 14th century. Homosexuality was a choice, and by choosing it, you were choosing to break with God. And so this is reflected physically by these men with their heads turned one way, the way that they're choosing, behind them, but their bodies going in another, right? Dante, the Pilgrim, sympathizes with these men. He loved them. He revered and respected them, but they're in hell. And Virgil, the poet, Virgil, the guide, scolds Dante for wasting so much time here with these people, because to Virgil, they're just sinners. But to the Pilgrim, that's his teacher, and we do bad things, but does that make us bad people? Well, in this book, if you're not willing to accept that what you did was wrong, here's where you go. All right. At this point, we've reached Circle 8 and 9, which is a lot of the book. So let's pause again, and then we'll come back in a minute, and we'll do that last third, okay? All right, welcome back to the last step in our whirlwind tour of hell, right? We're doing about an hour and a half, less than 2 hours tour of hell, and honestly, let's just be honest, it's just far too little time to spend in this amazing book. You can read all of the Inferno in a couple of days. It's just not that long. But you will spend the rest of your life, if you wish to, you could spend the rest of your life working through the entire comedy, as many of the greatest writers and thinkers of our history have. So once we get down to about Circle 8, we slow way down, and we find out that these circles are themselves divided into little sections. In fact, Circle 8 is called Malabolgia, which is just like little evil pockets. And what we find out is that this level of hell has got all these sort of holes dug into it with bridges that cross over the holes. And all the holes are for different kinds of sin, and there's different people in each one. And so instead of going from circle to circle, now we're going from sort of pit to pit. To get here, we had to cross over a huge chasm. It's kind of a little cliffhanger at the end of one of the cantos. They can't figure out how they're going to get across this huge chasm. And Virgil whistles up this monster, this Gurion, this flying demonic thing. And they ride on this thing across the chasm. This is only one of the many challenges that Dante and Virgil have had in their journey. For example, when they get to Dis, and the fallen angels won't let them in. And the pilgrims are like, well, what are we going to do? And Virgil goes in to talk to them, and the angels just like, they flip him off. And so he calls and gets an angel to come help, and this angel shows up and just throws the gates open, because of course, divine power cannot be resisted. This is not a contest. We had this idea, like from a lot of television shows and films and stuff, this idea that God and Satan are sort of locked in struggle, and it's a really close fight, and not in this book. In that's not, because God's power is ultimate. God is omnipotent, and Satan and all the demons, they are pathetic. They pose absolutely no challenge to anything God-related. So when an angel shows up, he just gestures, and the gates fly open, and he's like, I got no time for you guys. He doesn't even look at Virgil or Dante, because they're not even worth his time. He's got a mission that's all he's here to do. This whole journey for Dante, the Pilgrim, and Virgil is possible because Dante has people looking out for him. This is a chain of individuals who are all helping the Pilgrim on this journey. Why? Well, so that he can write this book, of course, so that he can write this book about hell, purgatory, and paradise, and thereby teach people that how the system works, and that there's a reason to it, and it all comes to a good end if you just do it right. We don't have this idea in Protestant Christianity. It relies on the idea of saints and patron saints, which is a Catholic idea. And the idea is, in Catholic theology, that God was just too remote and omnipotent, and he had so many things kind of going on and he was hard to relate to as an ordinary person. So you would, if you were in trouble, if you were in a bad spot, maybe you just came down with cancer, or you wanted a new job, or whatever, you're worried about your daughter, and you want to pray. And so rather than praying to God directly, not because you don't want to pray to God, but because God's inscrutable and kind of hard to place, you pick a saint and you pray to the saint. And you pray for the saint to intercede on your behalf with God. So you might pray to Mary or to another patron saint. Dante prayed to Saint, what was her name? Oh, Lucy. Saint Lucy, who was the patron saint of people who were losing their eyesight. When Lucy was a martyr, she was a saint who had her eyes pulled out, and so for her faith, because she refused to give up being a Christian. And so she became the saint of people who were losing their eyesight. She's always portrayed as this woman holding a dish, and her eyeballs are on the dish, right? It's crazy. One of those medieval artists. Well, anyway, so Mary told Lucy to help the Pilgrim in this journey, so Lucy went to a soul in heaven, whose name is Beatrice. Now this is important because Dante wrote love poetry to Beatrice before she died young. Beatrice had a husband. She was married to somebody else. Dante never had a real romantic relationship with her, the real person, never did. But in the context of his love poetry, she's his object of love. And so Beatrice, who's in paradise, is told by Lucy, who is told by Mary, to go help the Pilgrim get through, and to lead him all the way through hell and purgatory and all the way up through heaven. Well, Beatrice isn't going to go to hell. So she tells Virgil to lead him through hell and purgatory. And then, we won't read this part, but when Virgil finally gets to the top of purgatory, he says, look, I can't go any farther. I can't go to heaven. So Beatrice is going to come down here, and she's going to take you the rest of the way. Later. All right, so we're back in the Canto 8, the Malabolgia, and all this little. Now, at this point, we are in sins of the deceivers, right? Pimps, panderers, people who prostitute others or who set up people for lust, right? People who are go-betweens that help other people commit sins. Seducers and flatterers, all of whom are punished according to their own sins. So the flatterers, whose lines aren't worth shit, are buried in a river of shit, forever. And that's because that's what their words are worth. And it gets pretty grotesque as we go farther and farther down in hell, right? If you've reached this point in the book, you've already read scenes of people who are like their bodies are bent over backwards, or they're imprisoned inside burning tombs, and all kinds of And it's all that creative description. It's part of what makes the Inferno so much damn fun to read and to illustrate. In the same area, we find the simonists. Okay, simony was a particular kind of sin that we don't really talk about too much anymore. It's named after a guy in the Bible whose name is Simon Magus. And Simon Magus was a wizard. And after he saw one of the apostles exorcise demons, he tried to buy that power from the apostle. He said, look, I'll give you money. You show me how to do what you just did, I'll pay you. This becomes the crime of simony, to sell divine services for money. For example, oh yes, you need to be relieved of your sins. You're guilty of sins. You need to do punishment, penance. I'll give you penance in exchange for money. Or I'll make you a bishop if you give me money. I'll make you a cardinal if you give me money. I'll make you pope if you give me money. Or you are pope and you give out all of these jobs in return for money. Okay? This was an enormous source of political corruption in the medieval church. It was everywhere. From the smallest, at the lowest level of the church hierarchy, the individual friars and priests who would charge money for doing their job, right? Just like for Mass, like charging money for Mass. Okay, you're not supposed to charge money for Mass. That's your job to do Mass. All the way up to the top with popes who would give out cardinal positions and bishop positions in exchange for money. People who would get remission of sins in exchange for money. I'll pay you a bunch of money in return. You can relieve me of my sins. To us, it might seem weird that you could pay a bunch of money in return for not going to hell. But to the people of the medieval church, they thought this is how it worked, right? Well, I've committed X sins, X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to hell for this many years, and you can calculate it up. I'm going to be in hell for 500 years because of all these bad things I've done. So how much do I have to pay you to take a year off of that? Well, that'll be $20 to get rid of 1 year of sin. Okay, well then how about if I pay you $1,000 and that gets rid of all 50 years? Okay. Simony. Huge concern in the medieval church, source of massive corruption. And that's why we find out that not only is there a pope here in hell, guilty of simony. The simonists, by the way, are all stuck face down in these holes, and they're just stuffed farther down on top of each other as more simonists come in. They're just sort of pushed farther and farther down with each guy and their legs just stick up. So the next guy comes along, you just grab him and you turn him upside down and you just cram him down into the hole until his legs are sticking up. Oh, and by the way, the legs are on fire. Right? Just to make it worse. So there's a pope in here, and when Dante shows up, the Pilgrim shows up, the pope is like, oh, you're here already? And he thinks that the Pilgrim is the next pope who's already guilty of simony. And so on as we go through the Malbolgia, this layer of deceivers with one kind of deceptive, lying, betrayal sin after another. Hypocrites, thieves, deceivers like Ulysses and Diomedes. Okay, we remember them. You will meet Ulysses and Diomedes again in hell. Because what's their great deception? Think about it. Ulysses, great deception. Here's a hint. Horse, right? Yeah. Ulysses invented the Trojan horse. And to the people of the medieval era, the Trojans were the good guys. And so to defeat Troy through a trick, right? This gets back to some of the questions that we had in the midterm, is wrong and bad. Ulysses, if the Greeks had written the Inferno, Ulysses wouldn't be in it. He'd be in heaven, right? Because tricking the bad guys, that's good. That's smart. That's using your brain, right? But for Ulysses, for Dante, and for all the writers after the Greeks, including Virgil, Ulysses, straight to hell. There was another part of the Trojan War story that we didn't read, in which Diomedes and Ulysses sneak into Troy and they steal this statue to Athena, which According to myth, the city would never fall as long as that statue was in the city. It's called the Palladium. And so Diomedes and Ulysses steal it, and that's why Diomedes is here. You also find Sion, the priest that tells that story on the beach to the Trojans that we read about in the Aeneid. He's here. In these cantos, you'll also encounter a bunch of demons, these devils that hang out here, and they all have a bunch of them have names, and they actually serve as an escort for a while. They escort Virgil and the Pilgrim from one branch to another, but they lie. They tell Virgil that the road up there is broken, the bridge is busted. You're going to have to go this other way, and then that way ends up leading them off track, and they get kind of lost and off the road, and they find out that the demons lied to them. Well, why did they do that? Because that's all that demons can do, right? And Virgil tells this parable, sort of an Aesop's fable story, right, about a frog and a mouse. To these days, we tell that same story with the story of the frog and the scorpion, where the scorpion and the frog are both at the edge of a river, and the scorpion says, "Can you give me a ride across?" And the frog says, "Well, how do I know that on the way across you won't stab me? You won't hit me with your tail and sting me?" And the scorpion says, "Well, if I did that, we both die." And the frog says, "Okay, well, that makes sense. Get on." So the scorpion gets on the back of the frog, and the frog starts swimming across the river, and they're halfway across the river, and the scorpion stabs him. And the frog says, "Why did you do that?" And the scorpion says, "Because I'm a scorpion." Right? And the moral of the story is that sometimes people do their nature, they act according to their nature, even when their nature is self-harmful. And so it is with these demons, right? And that's this point of this parable that Dante tells you at the same time, that the demons are all deception. They are all sin. They literally can do no good. They can do nothing good. They can only do evil. They can only corrupt. So, for example, at one point, when the leader of the demons sends the other ones away to escort Virgil, they all salute their commander. That's their salute. Right? And then in return, the commander turns around and instead of blowing a horn, like a bugle or something, he farts in their general direction. Right? Literally everything they do is sort of grotesque and comedic in the sense of like burlesque. Okay. The thieves, in the Circle of the Thieves, it's a very strange chapter, and it's kind of horrifying, and it reminds me of like Prometheus or some bad aliens movie, because there are these snakes, and the snakes attack the people. They like bite onto their neck, but what happens is as the snake bites onto them, the victim turns into a snake, like his body mutates into a snake, and the snake mutates back into a person. And what we find out is that the snakes and the people are all people. They're all thieves. And now they're punished with stealing their humanity from each other constantly. That is, some of them are made into snakes and the others are left as humans, but the snakes all want to get their humanity back, so they attack the humans and they steal their humanity back by biting, and when the biting turns the victims back into snakes, who then repeat the cycle trying to get their humanity back. So the thieves are constantly stealing from each other, but not just, money, credit cards. They're stealing their very humanness. And the scene, when you read that scene, it's pretty deep into the book, when the serpent is changing, physically transforming back into a person, and the person is being physically mutated into the snake, is horrifying. It's horrifying. Because every body part is described as it twists and changes. It's pretty interesting stuff. Okay. Sowers of scandal and schism. This is in the sense of religious schism, are also here in Malebolgia. This includes Muhammad. Dante's understanding of the Muslim faith was not profound, okay? In the Middle Ages, they understood Muhammad as Dante in particular portrays him here as a kind of fallen Christian. Remember that the Muslim faith acknowledges the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It acknowledges Moses and Isaac and Jesus. It just adds another prophet that comes after all of them. It adds a third book, right, to books 1 and book 2. So Dante portrays him here as a fallen Christian who creates schism in the church. He takes a faith and he creates dissension within that faith. And so the people who are guilty of schism, who've created religious splits, are themselves physically split. Their chest is torn open and their faces are ripped open. So they have to push their mouths together so that they can talk because their faces have been broken open. It's horrifying. It's grotesque. This is Muhammad's place. The forgers, anybody who passed one thing off as something else. This includes people who are false accusers. So you see Potiphar's wife. Do you remember the story of Joseph? Potiphar's wife who accuses Joseph of trying to seduce her. And Potiphar has to put him in prison. That's where he is when Pharaoh pulls him out. And Sinan, who we mentioned earlier, he's also here. Anybody who passes one thing off as something else. Forgers. Think about how far deep in hell they are. Because this is all part of Dante's logic, right? Like, look, the biggest sinner in the cosmos, Lucifer, he didn't get there because he killed somebody. He got there because he lied. He cheated. He deceived. He betrayed. So those sins are worse. Finally, after all the Malbolgia, and the 8th circle goes on for many cantos because it's broken up in all these pieces, and we have all these dramas with the demons and Virgil and the Pilgrim getting lost and all that stuff. Until finally they reach the 9th layer of hell, which is a field of ice. We have this idea that hell is fire. But at the very bottom, there's 4 rivers in hell. There's one of blood and one of water and one of ice and so on, one of fire. Well, this is the river of ice, and it's completely frozen over, and people are put in the ice at different levels depending on their sin. Most people are in it up to their necks, but some people are so sinful that they're completely immobilized in the ice. They're underneath the ice, and their bodies are contorted in various positions underneath the ice. Dante's walking across the ice field. And what he feels is a wind. It feels like there's this big sort of gusting wind on the field of ice. And he can't tell what it's from. Like, what's causing the wind? And he asks Virgil, what's the wind coming from? And Virgil says, oh, you'll see. He says, is it coming from those big castle walls over there? Because he can see these momentous things on the horizon. And Virgil tells him those aren't castle walls. And he gets closer and he realizes that they are giants. They are the Titans, which in myth is the beings who fought with the gods, fought with Jove and Jupiter and Zeus, depending on whichever name you want to use for him. The Titans tried to overthrow those gods, Athena, Zeus, Apollo, and they failed. But for their rebellion, this is treason, they are frozen in the ice up to like halfway. But it includes their hands. Their hands are locked under the ice, so they can't move. Their chests are bare, and they're like 18 feet high just from the chest up, right? They're like the waist up. So they're giants, but their hands are locked under the ice, so they can't move. Those are the castle walls that the Pilgrim saw. And as he's walking through Cocytus, what it's called, the fields of ice, the river of ice, and it's divided into sections, again, 4 sections, named after famous sinners of each type. So you have Cana, which is where people go who have killed members of their own family, like Cain, right? Unferth would be there, right? Cana, killers of family, and then Antenora, which is named after Antenor, a famous character, betrayers of their own country. There's a special section just for people who have betrayed guests in their home, which should remind you of this notion of hospitality that we've been talking about so much. It's come up throughout every book that we have read. Hospitality, your obligation to strangers coming in from the cold. You're on the ninth circle of hell if you betray them. You are almost as far as you can go. Doesn't get much deeper in hell. This is called Ptolemaea after Ptolemy. And finally, the last part of hell, which is called Judeca after the great. If Lucifer is the greatest sinner in the cosmos, who was the greatest sinner on earth? Well, the guy that betrayed Christ, right? Judas. Judas, again, betrayal, right? More evidence that betrayal is the worst kind of sin there is. Judas's crime is not that he killed somebody. Judas's crime is that he betrayed Christ. So, the last circle of hell, the last part of hell is called Judeca. It is specifically for people who have betrayed their benefactors or their masters. People who have betrayed the people that are their superiors. Like Lucifer betrayed God and like Judas betrayed Christ. And in the bottom of the bottom is Lucifer himself. Not lording it over all the demons like he's king of this underworld or something. No. Because his sin is greatest of all. So he's punished greatest of all. And he's frozen in the ice, and he's this colossal giant. Like this massive figure. And he's a kind of inverted trinity. So if God is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, then Lucifer has 3 heads, 3 faces. And he has 6 wings, like 3 sets of wings. And he's covered in hair, and he's ugly. And he's locked in the ice from, most of his body. But he's got arms. And he's holding 3 sinners, one at each head. And he's chewing on them. Nom, 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 nom. And who are they? Well, one is Judas, who betrayed Christ. And his punishment is to be chewed on by Satan for eternity. It's hardcore. And the second guy is Brutus. And the third guy is Cassius. Brutus and Cassius are the 2 men that assassinated Julius Caesar. The crimes against the emperor, against the empire. They killed their own benefactor. And to Dante, who's an Italian, the death of the Roman Empire, or I should say, a crime of killing the first Roman emperor. Technically, Julius Caesar was not an emperor. He didn't live long enough to take that title. He probably would have, but he was just going to be crowned king. But to Dante, he was the beginning of the empire, the Roman Empire, and Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed him, are the closest thing he can think of to Judas. So Brutus and Cassius, they also get chewed on by Satan for eternity. And it's those wings beating. They're like giant bat wings, colossal bat wings. It's that beating wings that's creating the wind that Dante comments on, the Pilgrim comments when he first arrives on the fields of ice. You should look at Dory's illustrations for this too, because it's awesome. Well, so they've made their whole journey. What do we got to do now? Well, now we have to get out, and there's only one way out. There's this shithole, like literally, this hole at the bottom, underneath Satan. So they get onto Satan's body and they lower themselves down his big hairy body until they've reached the middle of the earth, which is right at his feet. And then they turn around and now they're climbing up. And this confuses the pilgrim because he's like, wait a minute, I thought we were going down. And Virgil says, well, we've gone past the middle of the earth, so now down is up. And they climb up the hole, and eventually they will reach purgatory. But that is beyond our book. Okay? Well, that's a really fast recap, hour and a half recap for the one of the most important books ever written, but it's my hope that you'll find it helpful as you read and as you go through it. The language is not hard, okay? But there's a lot there, and use all of your tools. Use illustrations. Use any notes that you take. Use your book's footnotes. Use the introductory material. Use your maps, okay, to track Dante and Virgil as they make their journey. Okay, and I really think that you'll enjoy it. I think if you let yourself get into it, you'll find that there's some pretty amazing stuff in there. Okay, all right, take care.